This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Today we're covering all questions relating to watering moss poles. How do I water them, how often I water them, why I water them, and so on. Hi everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. By far the most asked question is how I water my moss poles, why I water my moss poles, how I stop them from drying out so quickly, and so on. I've touched on all of this in depth before and I'll link more videos at the end screen, but I thought it would be a good idea to maybe make a really short and sharp tutorial on everything relating to watering moss poles. So let's start off with why I like to water my moss poles in the first place. Well, the moss pole is a vertical extension of the pot, meaning that most of the roots are within the moss pole. I water whatever substrate contains the roots because ultimately I water the roots. I want them to absorb water and nutrients. I don't water the substrate just for the sake of it. So water whichever part of your construction that has roots in it. In my instance, it is the pot as well as the pole. Which probably also answers the question, do I really have to water my moss pole? Well, if you want the roots within the moss pole to be proper water roots and absorb water and nutrients, then yes, you have to. If you want your pole to purely be a support and just have aerial roots, use the pole as like an anchoring support, then you don't have to keep your moss pole moist or water your moss pole. But to really optimize the plant's potential or to get the moist out of the plant in the first place, you want as many roots as possible. So why wouldn't you treat the moss pole like a vertical extension of your pot? Now that we clarified why I water the moss pole in the first place, let's touch on how I water my moss poles. Basically, two techniques. The first technique is I have a little sprayer. This one is actually like an electric sprayer, which makes life easy, and I can just go ahead and spray the moss pole. I don't know, I hope the camera picks this up, but you can probably see all of this water just going everywhere when I water this pole. Now this pole is still moist, so it actually contains the mess quite well. If the moss pole would be dry, it would make even more mess. Dry moss is hydrophobic, so water just pearls off. Like, can you see this over here, how the water just kind of pearls off? It doesn't really get absorbed. That's because the top of the moss pole is a little drier. So if I want to make this watering experience mess-free, I water before the moss is fully dry, because dry moss, hydrophobic, meaning it's gonna be messy before you can properly re-wet it. If it's truly more like really dry, I would just really finely mist it first. Once it absorbed a little bit of water, then I can go ahead and water thoroughly. But you can already see, I don't know if you can see, but this table is soaking wet already, and I haven't even really properly watered this one moss pole yet. So I don't like spraying my moss poles. I do it every now and then. I often do it with plastic back moss poles because they seem to contain the mess a little bit more. But I really just do it if I'm very short on time or if a plant is still at the very bottom of the pole and I really just want to wet the bottom part of the pole because, well, that's the part that contains the roots, or at least I want to encourage roots to go into that part. But I don't like spraying because I feel like it makes things really messy. What I like to do is called a bottle upside down technique. I didn't invent this. I saw Pest Plant Life using it first, so I'll give her the credit. Basically, I just got a water bottle and I drilled a few holes into the lid. I just used like a drill, right? Sometimes I have 3 little holes, sometimes 4 little holes, sometimes 3 bigger ones. I don't think the amount of holes or the size of the holes is all too important. It's all just physics, right? Let me put this upside down. If I hold this bottle upside down and I apply no pressure, it will kind of stop dripping. It's really hard to hold the bottle without applying pressure. That's because water has a surface tension. As soon as I break the surface tension, for example through my finger, you can see that water is getting released. That's all we need to do. But before we keep going with the video, let's hear from today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of online classes and members. With its large variety of classes ranging from photography to cooking to arts, marketing, business, graphic design and so on, it's the perfect place to learn new skills and put them into practice in an impactful way. Now, with spring over here in Australia, I started taking my camera and I just went on walks and I took so many photos of beautiful flowers. But I didn't feel like I was able to get the full value out of my photos. I didn't really edit my photos apart from just taking them into my iPhone and then just clicking edit. But I thought now that I have a better camera that takes better photos, it's maybe time to step up my editing game a little bit. So I recently got Lightroom, but you go into Lightroom and there's so many functions, can be a little bit overwhelming. So I found this class, What Makes a Good Photo? A Beginner's Guide to Editing in Lightroom by Daniel Nyabuko. What I really liked about this class is that Daniel first discussed light and what photography is in the first place.
The word photography is comprised of two different words, one being photon, derived from the Greek word phos, which means light, and the other word is graphy, and graphy means to write. From our definitions, we can see that photography means to write with light.
He then went on to describing all of the features that are in Lightroom and kind of just explaining what they actually mean.
HSL, hue, saturation, luminance. So the hue is what we call color. Red is a hue, orange, yellow, green. Those are all different hues. The saturation is how dense the color is. You know, how is it really saturated? I mean, that makes sense. And the luminance is how bright it is or how dark it is.
Let's have a look at a couple of photos. I put them up on screen based on my new editing skills. And this did not take a long time. I maybe spent about 2 to 3, 4 minutes on each of those photos. After watching that class, I feel like Lightroom isn't also overwhelming anymore and I'm looking forward to using it more often. The first 500 people to click the link in the description can get 1 month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you again Skillshare for sponsoring this video, but let's get back into it. Let's say I push all the moss down here for now, right? Can you see this? Yes. If I have my water bottle sitting on here now, I just pop it upside down. I have my water bottle sitting on here. The water bottle is not touching the moss. It's just hovering mid-air. And nothing is happening. There's no water coming out of this bottle because nothing is breaking the surface tension. Oh, by the way, I should have probably mentioned why the water is so brown. That is GT foliage focus and GT root zone that I put in the water because, again, I want to fertilize the roots, right? Wherever the roots are, the roots need to be provided with nutrients so they can absorb them. So I provide the moss pole with nutrients because that's where the roots will be. Now, for this water upside down technique to really work, we need to make sure that the moss pole at the top, I make like a little cavity almost. There you go. And that's where the bottleneck will go. So, and I now take the water bottle. Sorry, I compressed this a little bit too much earlier. When I now take the water bottle and I pop it in here, sometimes I have to wait a little bit, but straight away you see some water like bubbles, air bubbles getting released. That means that somewhere in that little cavity that I made, some moss is breaking the surface tension of that lid with holes in it and slowly starts releasing water. And that's all I want. And this is going to be mess free. There's nothing going to drop off, nothing going to like wet my table. As long as I make sure that the moss absorbs the water faster than the bottle releases the water. How do I make sure of that? If the moss is super dry, it has a harder time absorbing water. So I usually do this while the moss pole is still moistish, not super dry, so that the moss can absorb water much quicker. Secondly, sometimes if the water releases too quickly, I just wiggle the bottle around a little bit until I find a spot where it releases a little bit slower. So maybe a little bit, like maybe 1 or 2 of the holes are kind of being blocked and water is now just released on one of them. Ultimately, there's no crazy science to it. I just wiggle around up there until I'm happy with the rate of release of the water. Sometimes the bottle might take 3 hours to empty. Sometimes it might take 5 minutes to empty. It doesn't matter. As long as the water absorption capacity of your pole is higher than the water released by the bottle, this will end up being mess free. And the other benefit of this is that you're watering your moss pole thoroughly from the inside out using this bottle upside down technique. That means that the pole is gonna stay moist for longer. If you just spray the surface like I did with the sprayer, then obviously the surface is wet, but the core of the moss pole could still be dry. the surface is what touches the air. The surface is what dries out first. So if you just mist or spray your poles, you might experience that the day after it's already dry. Whereas if you water your poles thoroughly from the inside out, then the pole will stay moist for longer. Couple of other considerations. Obviously, due to gravity, the top of the moss pole will dry out first because all of the water starts draining into the bottom of the pole or the pot. Right? So if your plant has not reached the top of the moss pole, I still water the full pole so that, well, I don't have to water as often, if that makes sense. Yes, the top of the moss pole will dry out over the course of a week, but because I've watered the full thing and water keeps draining down, the bottom of the pole will stay moist pretty much all week long. So just reducing the frequency in which I have to water. Whether or not I have to water, I usually assess using a crunch test. So if I crunch the moss pole, I just judge by the sound whether or not the pole is still moist. If it's really crunchy, then it means it's dry. If there's no sound, it means that the moss pole is still moist. I just go around and like squeeze all of my moss poles to see whether or not I need to water them. Now, from a frequency perspective, that can be every 3 days in a really cool, dry week to every 10 days in a really dry and humid week. So I can't tell you the exact frequency, really depends on the conditions, the plant itself, how much water does the plant use, how much moss is in your moss pole, how thick is your moss pole, how much contact with the air does it make, and so on. Now, one thing that a lot of people ask me, but how can I prevent my poles from drying out so quickly? Yes, it's kind of easy, but I still want to do it as infrequently as possible. Well, the solution is plastic backing your moss poles. Right. If we just compare these two moss poles, I made both of them myself. One of them is just using a mesh and moss in it. The other one has a piece of plastic inserted at the back as well. That literally reduces the surface area that the moss has in half, right? Or by half, which means that only half the moss touches the air. The air is usually what's making it dry out because the air is probably going to be quite dry and kind of absorb all of that water from the moss pole. So if only half of the moss pole touches the air, then only half, it should technically, the water should technically evaporate in half the speed. But these days you can also buy these sort of poles if you don't want to make them yourself. Both of these are from Grow Vertical. I've got them linked in the description and I've got a discount code for you as well, and they ship internationally and they're made from plastic in the first place. So these are great to stop your poles from drying out so quickly in the first place, but I water them in the exact same way. So the watering techniques are still relevant no matter what type of moss pole you use. But if you grow in a really dry environment, for example, like if you know you don't have great humidity in your indoor setting, then yeah, I would just go with the plastic back moss poles, even though they might not look as aesthetically pleasing, but hopefully your plant is just going to cover the whole pole really quickly anyway. Now, I kind of explained why I water, how I water, and when I water, but one big concern that a lot of people have online is the act of overwatering. When we refer to overwatering, we usually don't necessarily refer to just watering too much or watering too often. It usually refers back to poor drainage within your potting medium. Now, we don't have to worry about drainage within the moss pole just purely based on its vertical extension. You know, it's gonna drain really well. Plus, it has a lot of surface area. So we don't need to worry about the drainage within the moss pole. But what we're worried about is that the water, based on gravity, is gonna drain from the pole into the pot and then potentially overwater the pot, because the pot is obviously made out of plastic, so way less aeration within the pot compared to the moss pole. Couple of ways of me preventing this is, well, number one, I use a very chunky aeroid mix. So that chunky aeroid mix always has great drainage, great aeration, so that already minimizes the chances of root rot based on overwatering. Secondly, I hardly ever water the pot. I only ever water the moss pole, and I let the excess water drain from the pole into the pot and let that water kind of be soaked up by the potting medium. I don't water the pot on top of that. Of course, if the plant only has roots in the pot and not in the pole, then I just water the pot, right? Again, we're watering whatever has the roots in it. I do water the pot, I just don't actively water the pot. I let the passive watering kind of thingy do its thing. Thirdly, after I do the bottle upside down technique, obviously all the water is going to slowly drain through, and I'll insert this video where you can really see the water being absorbed by that moss pole over time. If there's any excess water draining all the way through into the pot and then out of the pot, I check about 30 to 40 minutes after I watered, and I empty out the decorative planter to make sure that the pot in itself, the potting medium, is never sitting in the water in itself. What you can also do is you can try and find a pot that kind of hovers on top of its planter so that there's a little gap between the nursery pot and the planter that can where all of the excess water can kind of be caught without the pot sitting in it. And that applies to any plant really. If you have it on a moss pole or not, you don't want it to sit in too much water. You want your mix to be nice and aerated and so on to prevent root rot. But with moss poles specifically, the moss pole is going to dry out much quicker than the potting medium, meaning that I need to water the moss pole more frequently than the potting medium. So what I do is I just water in the same frequency that I'm used to keeping my moss poles moist, but I water with less volume. Let's have a look at this Mangela pothos over here, for example. And I'm sure you can't see the full thing, but that's okay. She's quite tall. So she's 180 centimeters tall. Let's say, for example, midway through the week, I come in and I squeeze the top of the moss pole and it's dry, and I squeeze the bottom of the moss pole and it's still moist and wet. Well, instead of maybe using a full liter of water that would drain all the way through, I'll just pop half a liter on there. That half a liter is just enough water to moisten the top of the moss pole, but not enough water for all of the water to drain all the way through. If I come here and the top of the moss pole is dry as well as the bottom of the pole is dry, then I would maybe have to use 1.5 liters, right? Ultimately, I'll pop the bottle on there, I'll see how far the water drains, and then I assess, again, squeezing, and if I feel like the water, and if I notice that the water hasn't reached all the way to the bottom and it's still crunchy there, then I add a little bit more, right? So ultimately, instead of playing with the frequency, I just play with the volume of water that I use. But the frequency is really determined by how crunchy the moss poles are, and that's determined by the conditions that they're in the first place, and whether or not I use a plastic backing. As moss poles have become more popular online, I noticed a lot of really creative ways of people watering their moss poles. For example, I saw people just taking a funnel, putting the funnel at the top of the moss pole and then watering that, letting it sip in again, and so on. I personally feel like there's no need for that. You know, the way I'll make that little cavity at the top of the moss pole, that is almost like a little funnel. So sometimes if I don't want to use a full upside down water bottle and so on, not feeling it, what I do is I just take the water bottle and I just pour a little bit of water on the top of every moss pole. And I might just do that every second day. So then I always top it up. There's always a little bit of water. It never fully dries out. So I'm having an easy time. Once the moss is already wet, you can just pour water in there and the moss can just absorb it fairly quickly. That might have been a little bit too quick, huh? But once the moss pole is moist, it absorbs water quite nicely. So you can just pour it in there and it will just more or less neatly be absorbed. So I personally don't see the need for a funnel, but still perfectly fine. I saw people making their own funnels out of a water bottle that they just cut in half. You can do that too. The reason why I like to use my water bottles is because I actually do things in bulk. So I have about 12 of these. I fill them with water, I fill them with my nutrients, and I put them in my kitchen cupboard so that when I notice a plant needs water, I just grab one of the bottles, pop it upside down, and done and dusted. I don't need to now go find my water bottle, go find my fertilizer, mix it all together, put it on there. Then I notice another plant. I need to wait for that bottle to be finished so I can do the next one. I'll have like 12 bottles around, so I can just walk around, pop one on all of the moss pots that need water, refill them in one go, and that's it. But for me to store them, I obviously need the bottle itself to still be intact. I've seen people have these little globes with like a spike on it that kind of is like slow releasing water, usually used I think for like succulents or like ferns, or like, I'm not too sure what you would usually use them for. My mom used to use them when we went on holidays and she couldn't water her bonsais, but some of them still died. But yeah, I've seen people buy those on Amazon and then just chuck them at the top of their moss pole because they look a little nicer than the water bottles, right? I mean, the water bottles is just temporary. They're just for watering, then I take them off. They're not staying on there for forever. I've seen people use like a drip irrigation hose where, you know, each little irrigation part goes into another moss pole. I personally find this to be a little ugly. Like, I don't necessarily want to have a hose in my apartment, but I could easily see how this works outdoors, for example. But outdoors, in my greenhouse, for example, I just take the hose and I just spray it all in one. I don't need to worry about the cleanliness of my watering process. I don't need to worry about drainage. Everything just drains on the ground and done and dusted. So I feel like outdoors, we don't really have this issue as much in the first place. But yeah, that was probably a little lengthier than I intended it to be, but I get really passionate about these topics and just kind of feel like I need to bombard you with as much knowledge as I have, kind of. But this was a shorter version. I have a longer version of this tutorial, and I also have a shorter version of this tutorial, and I have a like 2-hour, 2-part series of me watering my entire collection, where you can actually see me take these techniques and apply them to each and every single plant that I come across in my apartment. I'll link all of it in the description as well as at the end screen, so you can check out more references in relation to watering moss poles. But I hope this gave you a little bit of a high-level overview, and ultimately, be creative. There is no right or wrong approach as long as you keep the principles in mind, keeping your moss poles moist, but making sure the pot in itself is not drowning in water. Then your plant should have a good time attaching to the pole and growing to its full potential. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you next time. Bye.